Last lecture, I talked about the antebellum period in the United States, particularly all of the events and movements that took place that did not particularly uh, concern slavery. Today, we are talking about the same period, but specifically slavery, which was the very much pervading issue of the day. It was extremely controversial, probably the most controversial issue that America has ever had. And it is what put the United States directly on the path to secession. It was a long path, it was a bloody path, and the end was not pretty. And the presidents who were in charge on the path to secession, specifically in the 1850s, would be Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. Those were the four presidents who none of them served for particularly long. None of them served for more than a term. In fact, Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore served for one term combined because Taylor died in office and Fillmore, his vice president, took over. And during these 12 years that these four men were in the presidency, the U.S. was very much on a collision course toward secession. Something had to happen soon because, as Abraham Lincoln so famously said, our nation could not remain permanently half slave and half free. Something had to give. So the nation was really more divided than it had ever been, and slavery was at the core of that division. Now, these presidents were not really fit for the job. They were not able to solve these issues and oftentimes did very little, even in the face of mounting pressure to do something, sometimes just stood by. And their failures and inaction really made the Civil War inevitable. So let's talk about this time period, what caused the Civil War to happen. Well, wealth in the South was measured in terms of two things, land and slaves. And both land and slaves were treated as property to be bought and sold, and the amount of land and slaves you had determined your net worth. Now, Southern whites were sensitive to the fact that slaves were human beings. However, their uneasiness with this fact and the need to continually defend slavery caused them to become even more divided from the North. And they came to refer to slavery as, quote, that peculiar institution or our peculiar institution. Sometimes they even avoid saying the word slavery because it just sounds bad. And, we can't say things that sound bad. We have to sanitize it and make it seem less evil than it actually is. Now, in colonial times, slavery had been justified as an economic necessity. At least that's how people tried to justify such an immoral practice. But in the 19th century, apologists for slavery, or people who fiercely defended it, tried to use both historical and religious arguments in order to support their claim that slavery was somehow good for the slave as well as the master. Now, in many parts of the Deep South, slaves made up about 75% of the total population. Looking at the map there of the 1860 census, there were some portions of the South, for example, in South Carolina, where slaves far outnumbered whites. Now, fearing slave revolts, because in some places blacks outnumbered whites, Southern whites often restricted both the movement and the education of their slaves. They thought that if their slaves were allowed to move from place to place, they could talk to others and maybe get the ideas to revolt. And they believed that if they were educated, they could learn about how this is not the way everybody lives, this is not the way we are supposed to live, and then desire to revolt as well. The majority of slaves labored in the fields. They were agrarian workers. But many did become skilled artisans. Others worked as house servants. Some worked in factories, and others worked on construction gangs. Now, the average value of a strong field slave, was about $2,000 in the money of the day, which is about $60,000 today. So a strong young male in particular who could be used for decades in the fields would run the modern equivalent of about $60,000. Now, conditions of slavery really varied from plantation to plantation. Now, as a whole, conditions were exceptionally bad. They were deplorable in some instances. But at the same time, you do have some cases where slaves were treated humanely, while others, as I said, were routinely abused, often beaten. Families could be separated at any time by an owner's decision to sell a wife, a husband, a child. Women were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation since they were seen as the property of the owner. That meant they could take advantage of them sexually anytime, and there was nothing they could do about it. And despite the hard, nearly hopeless circumstances of their lives, so often African Americans were able to maintain a very strong sense of family and religious faith and derive meaning in their life from that and derive hope from that. There was always the hope that there will be a day when things will get better, when freedom can come. And even though some slave masters did treat their slaves humanely, the point was that they didn't have to by law, which meant that so many didn't. And the fact that at any time a slave could be beaten, could be raped with no legal consequences, left all African Americans in the South extremely vulnerable to those abuses. Slaves often contested their status through a range of actions, some much more bold, some more subtle. For example, sometimes slaves would engage in work slowdowns where they would intentionally work just a little bit slower so that the master couldn't make as much money, so that he wouldn't be as happy and maybe wouldn't see slavery as profitable for him. They would sometimes sabotage equipment, like maybe break the cotton gin so that they wouldn't be expected to pick cotton. They would often try to escape. Sometimes there were even attempted revolts. There were even a few major slave uprisings in the South during the Antebellum period. The most infamous, of course, was Nat Turner's rebellion. And this was very quickly and violently suppressed. But throughout the course of this rebellion, Nat Turner, a runaway slave, carried out a campaign to kill all whites he could find, especially white slave owners and their families. Turner's rebellion killed 55 white people, and then in retaliation, whites killed hundreds of black people, even some who weren't particularly involved in the murders of the 55 whites. Even so, they gave hope to enslaved black people. Even though the rebellions were never fully successful, they did sometimes give hope to enslaved blacks because it drove southern states to tighten an already strict slave code, but it also showed black people that the example had been set, and maybe next time it would be successful. But these revolts, in addition to giving hope to black people, causing southern whites to tighten their grip on slaves, thirdly, it also demonstrated to many Northerners the evils of slavery, because when something like this happens, when you have blacks killing whites and then whites killing blacks in retribution, this is going to make national news, whereas an occasional, just everyday beating or overworking on a plantation would not make national news. And so this would really gain the attention of Northerners and make them want to work to abolish slavery. There were also about 500,000 free African Americans in the U.S., about half of whom lived in the South and about half whom lived in the North. You can see in the map there the density of where the highest number of free African Americans lived. Some slaves had been emancipated during the American Revolution, kind of in the spirit of liberty. Some were mulatto children, which means half white, half black, and in cases where their white fathers decided to liberate them, they were sometimes freed. Others achieved freedom on their own when permitted through self-purchase, if they were fortunate enough to have been paid wages for additional work, usually as skilled artisans. But of the 250,000 free blacks in the South, most of them lived in cities where they could own property. Another reason why they would live in cities is because being out in the country, they were much more likely to be stolen and taken to a plantation, and people who would steal them would claim that they were runaways, but then they would enslave them again. Now, even though they were free, By state law, they were not equal with whites, really with any states, North or South, but especially in the South. They were not permitted to vote. They were barred from entering certain occupations. A lot of times they were not allowed to carry weapons. And they were constantly in danger of being kidnapped by slave traders. They had to show legal papers proving their free status. They had to carry their papers with them all the time. And if they lost them, then they were in serious danger of being re-enslaved. Some stayed in the South to be near family members who were still in bondage, and others simply saw the South as home. As dangerous as it was, were not able to or didn't want to move north. Now, the South developed a culture and outlook on life that was very uniquely its own by this point. Cotton really became king. It became the basis of its economy, and therefore, since cotton requires so much labor, slavery became the focus of all of the South's political thought. If you look at any of the secession papers that the secession conventions wrote in 1860 and 1861, they are constantly talking about slavery. Okay? Everything they talk about is about defending our precious peculiar institution of slavery, because in their mind, that is what their entire way of life was based upon, because if you take that away, they said their economy would go away as well. So white Southerners felt increasingly isolated from the rest of the country and the rest of the civilized world, really. And therefore, they became increasingly defensive about slavery. The closer and closer abolition came, the more bizarre and extreme the defenses of slavery got. And Northerners continued to grow more hostile towards slavery, and then other allies like England and France, other European nations, had outlawed it altogether. And so the South really felt the walls closing in upon them, and therefore became even more defensive and even more adamant about the necessity to keep slavery. Opponents of slavery were varied. Some were moderates who proposed a gradual abolition, and then you had more radical people who urged for immediate abolition and freeing slaves without compensating their owners. Now, you had some abolitionists who said, yes, we should abolish slavery, but we should compensate slave owners, meaning paying them to release their slaves. And then more radicals said, no, we shouldn't pay them to do what they should have done in the first place. They shouldn't be rewarded for having owned slaves. Now, the Second Great Awakening, which we talked about in the last lecture, encouraged a lot of Northerners to start viewing slavery as a sin, not just as an improper political practice like high taxes or something, but as an actual sin, a corporate sin, something that is evil and going against God. And this view of slavery as sin, a very correct view, really limited the possibilities for compromise, and it promoted a more radical abolitionism, because how can you compromise with sin when the Bible says we shouldn't compromise with sin at all? The American Colonization Society formed with the goal of sparing African Americans from the oppression they experienced in America. And the way that the American Colonization Society believed this would happen is if African Americans would be allowed to go back to their ancestral homeland, Africa. Now, nowadays, if that phrase is uttered, go back to Africa, that's a horribly bigoted thing to say to a person. But at the time, it was a little bit different, because at the time, the people of the American Colonization Society were genuinely trying to help African Americans to escape the oppression in America. But at the same time, you have this back to Africa idea appealing to racists as well. So maybe Northerners who were racist but didn't like slavery might support this too, in addition to the good people, because they wanted them out. Now, in 1822, the American Colonization Society established an African American settlement in Africa on the western coast, and they called this new settlement Liberia. Now, Liberia is still a country today. In fact, the capital is called Monrovia, named after James Monroe, who was president in 1822 when Liberia was founded as a colony. Now, only about 12,000 African Americans settled here from 1822 to 1860, but it was still seen as something that could be good for some in order to escape the racism of the U.S. The American Anti-Slavery Society was founded by William Lloyd Garrison, and he also published an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. Escaped slaves and free blacks were often among the most outspoken critics of slavery for obvious reasons. It was personal to them. But also they were some of the most convincing critics of slavery because they had experienced it themselves, and so people would listen to them and really take them at their word because they knew that they had seen it, they had experienced it, and therefore it was very convincing. One example of someone who was very outspoken and convincing in his abolitionist views was Frederick Douglass. He was someone who had been enslaved, who had been abused as a slave, who had been broken by a, quote, slave breaker, and he said almost died. And then he became free. He escaped and he got an education and became a very prominent abolitionist speaker. In fact, he was one person who was integral in creating the first black unit in the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts. So he was able to speak about the brutality and degradation of slavery from a more personal experience, and Douglass himself started the anti-slavery journal called the North Star. Other black leaders, such as Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, they helped to organize the effort to assist fugitive slaves, help them escape to free territory in the North. While others worked on legislation, they worked on practically helping slaves now, even before laws would be passed. How can you help people today get out of this horrible situation? And their idea was the Underground Railroad to help slaves escape to the North. This was a fabled network of conductors who were people who knew the route and would help escaped slaves, fugitive slaves along their way. And then you had stations, which were houses all along the route up north that sympathetic whites would lend to runaway slaves to sleep during the day, and then they could run away by night. Tubman herself was an escaped slave, and after escaping to the North, she then came back to the South to help others escape now that she knew the way. She took 19 trips into the South and helped 300 slaves escape to freedom. Now, once the Civil War broke out, Tubman, Douglass, and other black leaders continued to take a very active role in emancipation efforts, and they also supported black Union soldiers. Most Southern whites viewed any attempts at all to restrict the expansion of slavery as an outright violation of their constitutional rights. Specifically, they believed they had the constitutional right to take and use their property as they wished. You know, my property, my choice is kind of the mindset that they had, you know, that no one has the right to tell them what they can and can't do with their property. But the point was that the slaves were human beings. They were not property. They were being treated as property. Nonetheless, many Southern whites started to see all those who were in any way opposed to slavery's existence or just slavery's expansion as enemies. They saw both the abolitionists and the free soilers, those who wanted to keep slavery out of the western territories but keep it where it was in the South. They saw them as intent on the destruction of their rights and on their way of life, and therefore felt threatened by those in the North. Now, in 1852, a Northern white author named Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a classic novel that made a massive impact, and it was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this was a novel about the conflict between a slave named Tom and his brutal white owner named Simon Legree. And the book describes the horrors of slavery in very realistic terms and moved a generation of Northerners and Europeans who previously had no idea how slaves were actually treated. It moved them to regard all slave owners as monstrously cruel and inhuman. And while that certainly wasn't the whole story, it did, get the truth out that a lot of slave owners are this bad. And so Southerners considered the book to be lying propaganda, whereas Northerners saw it as a call to arms, as something that really called for abolition. I mean, you can quote all the statistics you like, but when you make a work of art like Uncle Tom's Cabin that exposes the evil that exists in something like slavery, that is what really moves a generation to action. Now, later on, when Abraham Lincoln met Miss Stowe, he said, "So you're the little woman who started this war." Now, the character of Uncle Tom, the phrase Uncle Tom is sometimes used derogatorily as kind of a slur for an African American who is submissive or subservient to whites, but really that's not a fair term at all, because it was based, the character of Uncle Tom was based on a real man, a hero named Josiah Henson. He was an author, he was an abolitionist, and he was a Christian minister. Now, he was born into slavery in Maryland, but then he later escaped to Ontario, Canada in 1830, and he founded a settlement and a laborer's school for other fugitive slaves. So he was similar to Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth in that regard. Now, Henson's autobiography, called The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself, very lengthy title, but this is what inspired the title character of Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And following the success of Miss Stowe's novel, Henson issued an expanded version of his memoir in 1858 called Truth Stranger Than Fiction, Father Henson's Story of His Own Life. And interest in Josiah Henson's life continued, and nearly 2 decades later, his life story was updated and published as Uncle Tom's Story of His Life, an autobiography of the Reverend Josiah Henson, which was published in 1876. The fugitive slave law is what moved many Northerners to see slavery not as a faraway issue that doesn't affect them, but something that is really tearing at the heart of their way of life as well. And this law required Northerners who opposed slavery to arrest and report slaves who had escaped captivity and fled to the North. And this was seen as a violation of the rights of Northerners. Northerners said, why should we have to uphold a law that doesn't even exist in our states, that slavery exists, that we completely oppose? Why should we have to violate our consciences and send fugitive slaves back to be tormented? So this idea that they would have to do this was seen as a violation of the rights of Northerners. Furthermore, the idea that slavery should be abolished in every state, Southerners viewed that as a violation of their property rights. And then at this time, most Americans feeling oppressed. Of course, you have 4 million African Americans being actually oppressed. A nation cannot exist for very long if everyone feels oppressed in some way. So the federal government had gotten larger and larger over the past 40 years, really starting when Andrew Jackson expanded the powers of the executive. And this issue of states' rights, which is addressed in the 10th Amendment, had become a very heated debate with regard to slavery. You'll have some people today say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was just about states' rights. It was about slavery. Now, yes, states' rights played a part to it, but the right that most Southerners were concerned about was the state's right to have slavery. The abolitionist movement had grown very large by 1860. And there was a lot of bloodshed and riots that started to occur on a yearly basis. One example would be Bleeding, Kansas, where a guy named John Brown, who was a violent abolitionist, he took it upon himself to slaughter slave owners. He would invade plantations, and he would kill all slave owners that he could get his hands on. There were a couple of instances of this, Bleeding, Kansas, and then Harper's Ferry in modern-day West Virginia. He was later hanged for this. He was hanged for murder, for killing slaveholders. But this increasing violence against fellow Americans really could not continue in a united country. This brings us to the establishment of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 on the platform of abolishing slavery. Remember, the Democratic Party was founded in 1828 around the central figure of Andrew Jackson. And the Republican Party was founded in 1854, specifically on the platform of abolishing slavery. Now, in 1860, the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected, and he vowed not to allow slavery to expand anymore. He was willing to let it exist where it is for now, but he vowed not to let it expand into the West. Now, in time, he hoped to abolish it altogether, but for the moment, he was being pretty moderate about it. Nonetheless, Southerners reacted violently to his election. They said the country is over at this point. This is the end of our republic. And white Southerners were scared, really. They felt that the election of a Republican would lead to the swift abolition of slavery in every state, which would ruin their economy and way of life. So they rebelled against Lincoln's election. They said, he's not my president. They even dressed up scarecrows in top hats and bow ties and burned him, called a burning effigy to Lincoln. And this is what caused so many Southern states to secede, to break apart from the Union. They said, we cannot remain a part of the Union if the leader of the Union is a Republican bent on getting rid of slavery. South Carolina was the first nation to take a step to secede. They seceded in December of 1860, which was a month after Lincoln was elected, but before he was even inaugurated. So the person who stood by and watched all of this secession happen was the President James Buchanan. Really didn't do anything about it, to the point where when Lincoln took office in March of 1861, secession had already happened. The country was split in two. So this meant that South Carolina, followed by 10 other states, broke from the U.S. and created their own country that they called the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis was made the president of the Confederacy. He was from Mississippi, and it was originally determined that the capital would be in Montgomery, Alabama, but then in order to convince Virginia to secede along with the other states, the Southerners agreed to put the capital in Richmond, Virginia, which eventually convinced Virginians to secede. So you have 11 states total forming the Confederacy. You can see them in the map there: Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. So with this, the nation was officially split, and then once Lincoln became president, he took it upon himself to bring the Union back together.